In this video, I'm going to take you through the process step by step of how I would approach the UV mapping for this crate. So once again, I'm going to select it as an object. I'm going to delete the history, freeze transforms, all that other fun stuff because I've made some changes and I just want to make sure this is clean. If I need to, I can check the outliner, make sure everything's cleaned up. I already know that there's no n-gons and that everything else is taken care of, so I can move on with it. But what I'm going to do is I am going to start fresh again simply by coming up to UV and going automatic. If you're not seeing these windows, once again, you can go to Windows, Modeling Editors, UV Editor, and if they are separated, so you've actually got two different windows set up, you can either keep them that way or drop one into the other so that you've got it just housed in there. And if you are not seeing the UV up here for UV and then going to automatic, once again, make sure that the modeling file menu is the one that's up. So with that in place, what I really need to do right now is make sure that this is set up in a way that I'm going to know what it is I'm painting when I move on to the texturing process. I also want to make sure that things are not overlapping, that things are not being distorted or skewed. So I will start from this front view, and the way I know it's the front is I look down at the bottom left and there's the Z, Y, and the X, and the Z should be coming towards me, so I know that that's the front. So if I select this face, I can find out where I'm grabbing. So this is the front face. I'm going to grab that UV and move this down so it's a little bit easier to see. And once again, to select that whole shell, I just double-clicked on one of the UVs. I'm then going to select the edge, and I can see that this is the next piece that can fit there. So I'm going to, if I go under the UV toolkit, making sure that right down under here, that the cut and sew is open, I am going to stitch together. Not sew because it'll just stretch and do that, but I'm going to stitch together. And when you have a case like this where you've got an even number of faces on both pieces, it will pick one and then move the other towards it. So I need to grab both of these and move them back out. If I want to make sure that that face is the same one and it's lined up, then I can check it right there and make sure. I can then move on to the next one. Grab this edge and do stitch together. And you saw that if I step back, that's actually flipped upside down. So that's the top, that's the bottom. But if I stitch that together, because this has more faces sewn in, it pulls that piece towards it. I can then grab the fourth side and stitch together. Now I do not want to grab it again because that will then connect those across, and that doesn't work for us. I need to have it cut someplace, so I'm going to have that left open. For my sake, just so I can understand where pieces are, I'm also, looking at it from the front, going to grab this top edge and stitch together. Now I don't necessarily need to because I'm going to have a natural edge seam there where the board flips over. But I want that there so that I have that ability to see where things are. So the edge seam that's going to occur here, I'm going to just make that a visual edge seam as part of the texture. And same thing on these. If I were to paint this up where the board, for example, would actually be overlapped slightly, I'm going to grab one of these pieces so it's a little bit easier to show. So imagine this white line here on the side is where the slat ends, and then this is the overlaying board. Then I would just paint this so that it has that transition over to the side, and then paint that so that it has the transition to the next board. And so don't think about it in terms of where the edge lines are, but think about it more as just kind of a placeholder for a larger area that you would then paint onto. Along with this, I'm going to grab this bottom edge here and I will stitch those together. In this way, I now have all of the major outer pieces sewn together so that this becomes understandable. So I know that when I look at this to create a texture with it, that this is the front, this is the right side, this is the back, this is the left side, that's the top, that's the bottom. Now this is generally where I have a lot of students go, great, I just need to keep doing that. So I'll sew in, so they'll grab this next edge and stitch that in, get those pieces, and then grab those edges and stitch that in to get that center piece that's on the inside. The problem with this is that it's going to create distortion and some other issues. So you can see that that's going across, but it's not generally the best way to approach this. There's going to be some natural edge seams. And what an edge seam is where you have a break along the texture where it needs to have a transition. In some cases, if I turn this grid off again, in some cases that's going to be there just by default. I need to have an edge seam someplace because I'm unwrapping a 3D object into a 2D space. And so there's going to be a seam here where it just has to have a transition from the texture on this side to the texture on this side, because I can't sew those together without deforming everything that's on the inside. So for example, if I look at it here and I turn that grid on, you can see how you get all the stretching deformation, and that's not what we want. But having that natural transition works there. And so you can do some edge seams just simply through leaving things cut. Other ones can be created, or the appearance of an edge seam, where you've painted that there's a transition within the texture. All right, so I need to worry about this a little bit though, because I don't want to have that stretching and distortion. There is a natural edge seam here where it will transition from the front of the board to the inside, and so I can actually leave those as separate pieces. I don't necessarily need to sew those in here. I would rather have less distortion and then the possibility of that edge not looking exactly right if I need to. The other thing I'll have students do is, yet again, well-intentioned, trying to grab, for example, this internal face, and I'm going to grab the edge really fast to see that that's the top, that's the bottom, and they will actually take the time to line this up exactly in the middle. Because the idea is that, well, I'm not going to have those edge pieces, but this is the same size, so that they're taking that good principle of trying to line it up, utilize space, because if I have these on the insides of these, of the front, then I'm using less space in the UV mapping area, and so I can line up a little bit better. And so there has to be a series of decisions made. For the first part of this, you can try and paint this and get it so that there is a transition if you do it this way, because these boards are going to be running different than the boards on the exterior. But in other cases, I'll have students just paint straight through and it looks like it was carved out of a single piece of wood. If you look at actual crates, they are not carved out of a single piece of wood. You don't need a wood grain running from this board down to the interior to this board. They need to be unique. And so I am making the decision, rather than trying to replicate this through the texture, I am going to give this face its own space. And that way it will help create a cleaner cut and transition from the texture that's on the front to the side and then to this interior. However, I am being very particular about how I lay out these faces. So if I grab this next face, this is on the top. Let me grab the edges so I can see which edges where. Okay, so that's lining up with this edge up here. So I'm going to move this over in place right here. I'm then going to grab the next face. Let's see if I can grab that one right there. Once again, grabbing that top edge, making sure that that's where it's lined up. Grab that UV again, move this into place. Grab the back face. That's the bottom right there. The other side, back face right there. And I'm actually going to bring this one up here. And that's on the bottom, as you can see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these UVs by double clicking so that whole shell's selected. Do the, where is it? I want to do the rotate. Ah, there we go. So under transform, under tools, I want to rotate this 90 degrees, and so I will rotate it and rotate again. And you can't really see what's going on, but now if I grab this edge, you can see that it's grabbing along the top. So I'm lining it up so that this top edge correlates with this edge here, and then there's not the face in between, but you can see it all lines up, so that visually when I go to paint this, I can see where things should be, where they line up. I'll then do the same thing over on this side. And once again, I've got another face here, and I'll bring this over above it. I want to grab this edge and see that that lines up. Yep, it's right there at the top. If I want to make these exactly line up with each other, I can use the align and snap tools and grab all of them, snap those up, grab all of those, snap those up. And then I could even line it side to side and make sure it's exact if I really want to. With this one, I'll bring it down, and then I just want to check and make sure that this kind of aligns with this edge here. So I'll grab both of those edges, and they don't. So that's where I need to make a slight transition. So that edge is right here, and I want to get the edge that correlates with that, which is this one. So I need to rotate this to the right 90 degrees. So once again, here under transform, under tools, make sure that it rotates 90 degrees, rotate it. So now when I grab that edge, you can see that it lines up. So this is the base of this thing. And once more, there is more than one way to approach UV mapping. I'm laying it out in this way so that for me it makes sense. Everything has its own 0 to 1 space, or it's got its own space that'll fit into this 0 to 1 space. Nothing is overlapping, and everything is aligned in a way that makes sense to me. So I know that this is the front slats on the front of the crate. This goes around the side, back, other side, bottom, top. And then the correlating interior pieces. So this is the interior piece for this face. This is the interior piece for this face. This is the interior piece for the top. These two on the top correlate with the pieces below, and then this one is connected to the side. So it makes sense for me where I want things to line up so that as I'm painting, I'm able to figure out, okay, this is on the bottom, so I'm going to make that a little grimier. I'm going to have like an oil stain that hits here that's going to come up on another piece and then into the bottom section, so that's where something like leaked out. This is the top. I'm going to have a little more dust there, maybe on the bottom edge here, where I've grunged it up. I'm going to have streaks coming down from the top of the crate. It also helps you orient where the slats go, where the boards are, and it's allowing me to understand visually where I want pieces to be. And so anytime you're doing UV mapping, once again, think of things in terms of the overall shape, function, form, what you want to do with it in the long term. Now for the interior pieces, let me get this back into position. So I'm looking at it from the front. So continuing on, now that we've got this basic form, we've got everything lined back up, I'm going to start moving on to the next pieces. So looking at it from the front, I've got these interior faces. Now these could simply be used the way they are, just left as individual pieces, because there are going to need to be some natural breaks because the boards are going to be different. They're not going to line up exactly. So I can leave them that way, but for ease of use and also just to show you the tools, I'm going to start sewing these together. So I will grab these edges here, grab that right there, and I can do a stitch together. And so with all except for one of these edges selected on the interior, it has now connected these four pieces. Keep in mind this does create a little bit of a problem where these are connected and I need a texture transition, so you need to be aware of where those transitions are so you can paint the changes into them. Also, if you accidentally select all four of those edges and stitch together, you'll get shapes like this that will just overlap. It'll look like they're two faces when in reality they're four just folded onto each other, and that can become problematic as well. So I'm going to do this going all around the form where I can grab these individual pieces and grab the edges. If I want to, I can switch to wireframe mode so it's a little bit easier for me to see, and shift select 3 of the edges at a time. Move on to the next side. That edge, and if I'm not getting a good enough angle, that edge right there. That one, and that one. The reason I'm in wireframe, even though there's sections behind it that make it a little bit more difficult to see, is so that I can grab through and make sure that I select the correct edge. I'm going to come to the top, do the same thing. So grab 3 edges. And the bottom. grabbing 3 edges. So holding down Shift right before I click each time. And then I can do stitch together and it will connect all of those at the same time. So if I grab all these UVs, I can actually just grow the selection rather than double clicking on them individually. Once again, to grow or reduce the selection, it's holding down Shift and then using the alligator teeth, the greater than, lesser than symbols, or the comma and period keys. And so I just grew the selection after selecting those original ones. I can then take these, if I want to, and line them up. Because I know I'm going to need a transition in roughly the same spot on all of them, I'm making a decision right now to align these. Once more, there's more than one way to do it. As long as you're following the basic rules of making sure that everything is in its own space, that it will all fit in that 0 to 1 space at the end, and that it's understandable as to where things are, then it's easier to set this up. Then you can actually set it up however you need to that works for you. For me, once again, I'm doing this as partially an example to show you how I can align, how I can use the tools, but also just so it's easy to understand where things are. So, for example, if I have that one there, I know that's where it's going to line up. Grab there, there. And you can see I'm getting slightly different transitions across these based on where they are. So that's the top, which is there. Top for this one's down here. So these aren't lining up exactly the way I might want them to. And so this one, I will actually rotate this over. So that's the top there. That's the side. That's the top. So I'm actually going to making sure that I'm aligning these a little bit better. Okay, so those 4 work for me. This piece right here is not working for me as well. So what I want to do is I'm going to rotate this over. I'm also going to cut it right here. So let me zoom in. So grab that, cut, grab that top edge there, stitch together. So that moves it up. And so now when I grab that top edge, it's also in the same spot. So these are all going to be roughly the same area. Same with this one. I just need to make a minor adjustment. So I'm going to come in, cut that edge, grab that top piece, stitch together, which moves it down. And so now they're all roughly the same area. And so if I do want to line them up, so this would be the bottom piece, this would be the top, this would be the front, the next piece, and the next one, and the last one. So this way I've got a hierarchical order, so I know where things are. That's the bottom, front, side, back, side, top. I can then take all of these, and I will rotate all of them together. Oh, back a step. And then I'm going to fit them in on top of this area. Now there's a couple things that I'm going to have to make minor changes to. So grabbing this, moving it up, grabbing this, moving it down so that I can better utilize the space. I don't want them right next to each other because then it will once again cause problems where they're lined up. It won't be as bad simply because they're not connected. So from one side to the next you may not notice the difference, but I'm going to leave just a slight gap to make it work for me. I'm then going to grab all of these UVs, and coming down to a line, I'm going to flatten those and just do this a section at a time so that as I'm texturing, I can actually create a marquee box or a selection box that will allow me to paint just within a specific side at a time so that I will get that edge seam cut. But knowing where these are will allow me to also understand where things are being painted, what they're being painted for. And so this is a way of laying it out. Once again, there's not just one way. There are other ways I could have approached it, but this is a way that also shows you the tools, and it makes sense to me. I then want to grab these pieces. We've got these cross sections, so I'll start with the front one and grab this face. I'm going to move this to the side, and it may bounce back, but this allows me to get things lined up. I'm going to grab both of those edges, and I'm going to stitch together. And so it grabbed the other two faces that were on there. Once again, these pieces are made of only 3 sides. So the other 2 sides were removed. Because of the construction, because I know that this was modeled exactly at 45 degrees, I can actually take this, and I'm going to make sure that this is the top section. So grab those edges, so that's at the top. And for ease of use for painting, I can flatten it by rotating it 45 degrees. And I can either rotate it up or back. And so this is another reason working at right angles, working at very specific angles, it can be very beneficial and useful to help you get things lined up. So now when I texture this, I can texture it as if it was a board rather than trying to texture it at an angle and having problems. I can do that wood grain running a specific direction. And then with it set up here, so if I turn on that grid, you can see that it would run correctly up and down the board, where over here I would have to angle it just right to make it happen. So this is, once again, me making a decision. So think about your process and work on making decisions based on how things are constructed. So I'll turn that off again so it's visible. I'm now going to move on to the next face, which is this one here. Grab both of those edges, stitch together. See if this is the top part, which it is. So I will grab those, and I'm going to rotate this up and then over and down so it's the same orientation. The next face on the back, so it's this one here. We'll stitch those together, and this will be the final side. Stitch those together. I'm going to check, see where the top is. That's actually the bottom, so I'm going to rotate this all the way across so that the bottom's coming off to the right. Move that in. Check the top for this one, and that one is at the top. So grabbing these UVs, laying this down, and now I've got these pieces, and so what I'm going to do the front, the side, and I will give a little bit of a gap in between these. The back, and then the next side, and I could equally try and stand them upright and move them over here, but I'm just going to leave this as it is for now. I can then grab all of these and move them up into the space. Now if these had come out at different sizes, then I would have to worry about also double checking, making sure that everything lines up well and is roughly the same distance, so that I don't end up with pieces like, let me grab this front piece, pieces like this that are completely different. But because it did the automatic mapping and it mapped it out as a cube, it's actually fairly even right now. And so then what I'm doing is just trying to figure out how to best utilize the space. The piece that I can't really adjust because of the way it's sewn together are these 4 sections across. And so I'm capped at how far side to side I can go as I scale this up to better utilize the space here. And so as long as everything else fits in top to bottom, then I'm kind of using the space as well as I can. So what I'm going to do with these is I will once again grow my selection by holding down Shift and hitting the period key a few times. I can't quite move it over and fit it into place, but what I can do is I can shift this over enough that I can then grab these sections and try and find new ways to approach this. If I really want to make sure that these fit, I may want to simply move this up a little bit, and this is where I can start playing around. I'm actually going to move these back into place. For example, taking these, I'm going to move these down while grabbing these right here, holding down Shift and tapping the period key a few times, and bringing these up. I'll then bring all of these up a little bit higher, growing the selection again, and that should allow me enough room to drop this in down below. And I can see that there's a little bit of distortion that's happening from where these were sewn together, so I can also still do a little bit more aligning if I need to, where I can come down here to align, flatten those up, grab this next row, flatten those. I can do the same thing to this section above where I can see that there's a slight shift, flatten that down, and so on and so forth. You can see how this all works. And then if I really wanted to align these parts as well, I could also start lining those up. But in general, I just want to make sure that everything's in here. One final note about this is that I'm not taking this all the way to the edges. What you want to do is leave a little bit of a gap, because there's a filter that's going to be on that causes your texture, where it hits this edge and repeats again, to bleed just a little bit. The filter blurs it, and so anything that's on this side or this left side of the texture will bleed over just a little bit onto this side. And so if you've got a big transition from where this side ends to the next side, it'll come back and create funny textures and shaping. And so I like to pull the UVs in just slightly from the edges so that we don't have that problem. And these I'm going to shift over just a little bit more because there's no reason to have them quite so close. And that way everything fits nice and evenly into that 0 to 1 space. So I'm going to stop this video here and come back in the next one to talk about cleanup, saving, and UV snapshots.